Well, I hope you guys are all doing very well. This is volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, Psychology and Religion, West and East. We are currently reading a psychological approach to the dogma of the Trinity, published in 1942 and 1948. Currently on chapter 5. The problem of the fourth. Section 2. The psychology of the Trinity. As I have shown in the previous chapter, one can think out the problem of the fourth without having to discard a religious terminology. The development of the Trinity into a quaternity at the same time, the exposition gains in plasticity. But any statements of this kind can, and for scientific reasons, must be reduced to man and his psychology, since they are mental products which cannot be presumed to have any metaphysical validity. They are, in the first place, projections of psychic process, and nobody really knows what they are in themselves, i.e., if they exist in the unconscious sphere and accessible to man at any rate. Science ought not to treat them as anything other than projections. If it acts otherwise, it loses its independence. And since it is not a question of individual fantasies, but at least so far as the Trinity is concerned, of a collective phenomenon, we must assume that the development of the idea of the Trinity is a collective process, representing a differentiation of consciousness that has been going on for several thousand years. In order to interpret the Trinity symbol psychologically, we have to start with the individual and regard the symbol as an expression of his psyche, rather as if it were a dream image. And it is possible to do this because even collective ideas once sprang from single individuals and moreover can only be had by individuals. We can treat the Trinity the more easily as a dream in that its life is a drama, as is also the case with every dream that is moderately well developed. Generally speaking, the Father denotes the earlier state of consciousness, when one was still a child, still dependent on a definite, ready-made pattern of existence, which is habitual and has a character of law. It is a passive, unreflecting condition, a mere awareness of what is given without intellectual or moral judgment. This is true both individually and collectively. The picture changes when the accent shifts to the son. On the individual level, the change usually sets in when the son starts to put himself in his father's place. According to the archaic pattern, this takes the form of quasi-father murder, in other words, violent identification with the father, followed by his liquidation. This, however, is not an advance, it is simply a retention of the old habits and customs with no subsequent differentiation of consciousness. No detachment from the father has been effected. Legitimate detachment consists in conscious differentiation from the father and from the habitus represented by him. This requires a certain amount of knowledge of one's own individuality, which cannot be acquired without moral discrimination, and cannot be held on to unless one has understood its meaning. Habit can only be replaced by a mode of life consciously chosen and acquired. The Christianity symbolized by the Son, therefore, forces the individual to discriminate and to reflect, as was noticeably the case with those church fathers who laid such emphasis on knowledge as opposed to the same, The same tendency is apparent in the New Testament controversies over the Jews. Righteousness in the eye of the law, which stands exclusively for the old habitus. The third step finally points beyond the Son into the future to a continuing realization of the Spirit, i.e., a living activity proceeding from Father and Son, which raises the subsequent stages of consciousness to the same level of independence as that of Father and Son. This extension of the fellatio, whereby men are made children of God, is a metaphysical projection of the psychic change that has taken place. The Son represents a transition stage, an intermediate state, part child, part adult. He is a transitory phenomenon, and it is thanks to this fact that the Son gods die in early death. Son means the transition from a permanent initial stage called Father in Octer Rerum, the stage of being a father oneself, and this means that the Son will transmit to his children the procreative spirit of life which he himself has received and from which he himself has begotten, brought down to the level of the individual. The symbolism can be interpreted as follows. The state of unreflecting awareness, known as Father, changes into the reflective and rational state of consciousness, known as Son. The state is not only in opposition to the still existing, it also contains many latent possibilities of disassociation, and increased discrimination begets conflict that were unconscious but must now be faced, because unless they are clearly recognized, no moral decisions can be taken. The stage of Son is therefore a conflict situation par excellence. The choice of possible ways is menaced by just as many possibilities of error. Freedom from the law brings a sharpening of opposites, in particular of the moral opposites. Christ crucified between two thieves is an eloquent symbol of the fact the exemplary life of Christ is in itself a transistus, and amounts therefore to a bridge leading over to the third stage, where the initial stage of the Father is, as it were, recovered. If it were no more than a repetition of the first stage, everything that had been won in the second stage, reason and rebellion, would be lost, only to make room for a renewed state of semi-consciousness of an irrational and unreflected nature. To avoid this, the values of the second stage must be held fast. In other words, reason and reflection must be preserved intact, though the new level of consciousness acquired through the emancipation of the Son continues to the third stage. We must recognize that it is not the source of the ultimate decision, and flashes of insight, which rightly go by the name of gnosis, but that these are inspired by a higher authority, which in projected form is known as the Holy Ghost. Psychologically speaking, inspiration comes from an unconscious function. To the naive-minded person, the agent of inspiration appears as an intelligence, correlated with or even superior to consciousness, for it often happens that an idea drops in on one like a saving deus ex machina. Accordingly, the advance to the third stage means something like a recognition of the unconscious, if not actual subordination to it. Adulthood is reached when the Son reproduces his own childhood state by voluntarily submitting to a paternal authority, either in psychological form or factually. In projected form, as when he recognizes the authority of the Church's teachings, this authority can, of course, be replaced by all manner of substitutions, which only proves that the transition to the third stage is attended by unusual spiritual dangers, consisting chiefly in rationalistic deviations that run counter to the instincts. Spiritual transformation does not mean that one should remain a child, but that the adult should summon enough honest self-criticism and mixed with humility to see where and in relation to what You must behave as a child irrationally and with unreflecting receptivity, just as the transition from the first stage to the second demands the sacrifice of childish dependence. So the transition to the third stage, an exclusive independence, has to be relinquished. It is clear that these changes are not everyday occurrences, but are very fateful transformations indeed. Usually they have a numinous character and can take the form of conversions, illuminations, emotional shocks, blows of fate, religions, or mystical experiences, or their equivalents. Modern man has such hopelessly muddled ideas about anything mystical, or else such a rationalistic fear of it, that if ever a mystical experience should befall him, he is sure to misunderstand its true character and will deny or repress its numinosity. It will then be evaluated and as an unexplainable, irrational, and even pathological phenomenon. This sort of misinterpretation is always due to the lack of insight and inadequate understanding of the complex relationships in the background, which as a rule can only be clarified when the conscious data are supplemented by material derived from the unconscious. Without this, too many gaps remain unfulfilled in a man's experience of life, and each gap is an opportunity for futile rationalizations. If there is even the slightest tendency to neurotic disassociation or indolence verging upon habitual unconsciousness, then false casualties will be preferred to truth every time. The numinous character of these expressions is proved by the fact that they are overwhelming, an admission that goes against not only our pride but against our deep-rooted fear that consciousness may perhaps lose its ascendancy, for pride is often only a reaction covering up a secret fear. How thin these protective walls are can be seen from the positivity, terrifying suggestibility that lies behind the psychic mass movements, beginning with the simple folk who call themselves Jehovah's Witnesses, the Oxford groups. So named for reasons of prestige among the upper class and ending with the national socialism of a whole nation, all in search of the unifying mystical experience. Anyone who does not understand the events that befall him is always in danger of getting stuck in the transitional stage of the sun. The criterion of adulthood does not consist in being a member of certain sects, groups, or nations, but in submitting to the spirit of one's own independence. Just as the son proceeds from the father, so the father proceeds from the son. From some stage of the son, yet this father is not a mere repetition of the original father or an identification with him, but one in whom the vitality of the father continues its procreative work. This third stage, as we have seen, means articulating one's ego consciousness with a supraordinate totality, of which one cannot say that it is I, but which is best visualized as a more comprehensive being. Now, one should, of course, keep oneself conscious of all the time of the anthropomorphisms of such a conception. Hard as it is to define, the unknown quantity can be experienced by the psyche and is known. Skylar, get away from that, please. This is known in Christian parlance as the Holy Ghost, the breath that heals and makes whole. Christianity claims that this breath also has personality, which, in the circumstances, could hardly be otherwise. For close on 2,000 years, history has been familiar with the figure of the cosmic man, the anthropos, whose image has merged with that of Yahweh, and also of Christ. Similarly, The saints who received the stigmata became Christ figures as a visible and concrete sense, and thus carriers of the anthropos image. They symbolize the working of the Holy Ghost among men. The anthropos is a symbol that argues in favor of the personal nature of the totality, i.e. the self. If, however, you review the numerous symbols of the self, you will discover not a few among them that have no characteristics of human personality at all. I won't back up the statement with psychological case histories, which are terra incognita to the layman anyway, but will only refer to the historical material which fully confirms the findings of modern scientific research. Alchemical symbolism has produced, aside from the personal figures, a whole series of non-human forms, geometrical configurations like sphere, circle, square, the ruby, diamond, quicksilver, gold, wire, water, fire, and spirit in the sense of volatile substance. This choice of symbols tallies more or less with the modern products of the unconscious. I might mention in this connection that there are numerous theriomorphic spirit symbols, the most important Christian ones being the lamb, the dove, and the snake, Satan. The snake symbolizing the Gnostic now, and the agritharium as a pneumatic significance. The devil too is a spirit. These symbols express the non-human character of the totality or self as was represented long ago. When, at Pentecost, the Spirit descended on the disciples in tongues of fire. From this point of view, we can share something of Origen's perplexity as to the nature of the Holy Ghost. It also explains why the third person of the Trinity, unlike Father and Son, has no personal quality. The Spirit is not a personal designation, but the qualitative definition of a substance of aeriform nature. Whenever, as in the present instance, the unconscious makes such sweepingly contradictory statements, experience tells us that the situation is far from simple. The unconscious is trying to express certain facts for which there are no conceptual categories in the conscious mind. The contents in question need not to be metaphysical, as in the case of the Holy Ghost. Any content that transcends consciousness and for which the apperceptive apparatus does not exist can call forth the same kind of paradoxal or antinominal symbolism. For a naive consciousness that sees everything in terms of black and white, even the unavoidable dual aspect of man and his shadow can be transcendent in this sense and will consequently evoke paradoxical symbols. We shall hardly be wrong, therefore, if we conjecture that the striking contradictions we find in our spirit symbolism are proof that the Holy Ghost is a complexio oppositorium, union of opposites. Consciousness certainly possesses no conceptual category for anything of this kind. For such a union is simply inconceivable, except as a violent collision in which the two sides cancel each other out. This would mean their mutual annihilation, but the spontaneous symbolism, the complexio oppositorium, points to the exact opposite of annihilation, since it ascribes to the product of their union either everlasting duration, that is to say, incorruptibility, and adamantine stability, or supreme and inexhaustible efficacy. Thus, the Spirit, as a complexio oppositorium, has the same formula as the Father, the actor rerum, who is also, according to Nicholas of Cusa, a union of opposites. The Father, in fact, contains the opposite qualities which appear in his Son and his Son's adversary, Requa Sharif, has shown just how far the monotheism of the Old Testament was obliged to make concessions to the idea of the relativity of God. The book of Job comes within a hair's breadth of the dualism which flowered in Persia for some centuries before and after Christ, and which also gave rise to various heretical movements within Christianity itself. It was only to be expected, therefore, that, as we said above, the dual aspect of the Father should reappear in the Holy Ghost, who in this way affects an epicarisis of the Father. To use an analogy from physics, the Holy Ghost could be likened to the stream of photons arising out of the deconstruction of matter, while the Father would be the primordial energy that promotes the formation of protons and electrons with their positive and negative charges. This, as the reader will understand, is not an explanation but an analogy, which is possible because physics modules ultimately rest on the same archetypal foundations that also underlie the speculations of the theologian. Both are psychology, and it too has no other foundation. I think